Plagiarism is rampant among American preachers. There's actually a multi-million-dollar industry built around it. Hi, I'm Jeremy. I'm a deep skeptic, also a pastor. So not all pastors do this, of course. I have been able to work with a number of pastors in a close enough situation where I knew their sermon writing process. And I've actually heard the exact same sermon preached by many different pastors. And if I have to estimate in my experience, it was about 75% of the pastors that I've ever worked with actually do this practice where they plagiarize other people's sermons. So there's two ways this happens. There are famous pastors that are incredible speakers that will deliver a sermon that wows clergy people at conferences and online, and those clergy people will then just preach the same sermon. And not say, like, I heard this from this really famous pastor. One of the most famous ones that I have seen over and over again was a sermon that was preached by a guy named Louis Giglio, where he ended up talking about a molecule called laminin, that his diagram of that molecule was cross-shaped, and it sort of ties all of these pieces in our bodies together, and it was a brilliant sermon. It gave me chill bumps when I first heard it, even though that diagram of the molecule isn't really accurate. But I then heard this over the next 5 or 10 years, probably 6 times. Every time, no one referenced Louis Giglio. The second way that this happens is through the industry that's been built up around it. You can buy individual sermons, you can buy sermon series, you can subscribe to platforms that have hundreds and hundreds of sermons available in them, and there's also free options for that. And when you buy a sermon series or download stuff from one of these platforms, you often get things like PowerPoint templates and videos that can make sermons much more engaging. And I had ChatGPT do some research on that market and the number of pastors and all of that kind of stuff. And an estimate for this industry is definitely more than $15 million. And it's a reasonable thing to think it's a $50 million industry. And don't get me wrong, buying or downloading a sermon to help you with research or even just to use and to preach, there's nothing wrong with that. It can be really helpful if you're a pastor that's not really great at public speaking, or if you don't have the time to do the research that is required to have a really interesting sermon teaching. The problem comes in the deployment. I was taught in elementary school, middle school, high school, college, and graduate school that if you use somebody else's words or their ideas, you have to attribute it to them. Otherwise, it's plagiarism. Otherwise, you're basically lying and claiming their words or ideas as your own. And practically speaking, when I have delivered sermons that sourced ideas from scholars or from other famous pastors, and I've said, hey, this scholar says this, or I got this really great sermon from this famous pastor, nobody has ever said any negative comment to me after the sermon. And nobody has said, oh, I'm going to leave the church because this pastor is not using his own ideas. The problem is, like I said before, 3/4 of the pastors that I have ever known well enough to know their sermon writing process has routinely used ideas and direct content, even full sermons from other pastors, without attributing it to them at all. And that's a real problem. And I can already hear the comments, people saying, why even make this video? Why call pastors out like this? Well, I actually make a bunch of videos exposing religious corruption. And I do that because when these kinds of practices aren't exposed, then they go unchecked. And these practices are just not okay. And if you want to know if you've ever heard that super famous sermon about that molecule, just Google laminin and look for the images of the cross-shaped molecule. I am sure it will bring it back to your memory. And, maybe just notice how many of those images appear on how many different church websites.